Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and later in the show, I'll be joined by Eleanor Penny. Of course, an awful lot of incredibly important stories to discuss today, mainly all about the growing conflict in the Middle East. We'll also take a look at the latest from Tory Conference. The IDF says 8 of its soldiers have been killed as Israel expands its ground invasion of Lebanon. Hezbollah-associated media claims this was the first confrontation between Hezbollah fighters and IDF soldiers since the Israeli ground invasion of Lebanon was announced. The IDF has released footage, it says, shows ground operations in southern Lebanon. It says that commando and paratrooper units have recently crossed the border, joining special forces units it claims have been carrying out cross-border raids for months. This all comes after another night of intense bombing of the southern suburbs of Beirut, with at least a dozen airstrikes launched. Local sources say civilians were given just 10 minutes warning to evacuate before apartment blocks were hit. This latest round of bombing brings the total death toll from recent Israeli attacks on Lebanon to 1,873. The intensification of fighting in Lebanon comes a day after around 200 ballistic missiles were launched at Israel by Iran. They began landing at about 8 p.m. local time. Iran has claimed that all targets were military, and several missiles appear to have hit Israeli air bases. Israel has said that no aircraft were damaged, while Iranian news agencies have claimed that 20 F-35 fighter jets were destroyed. Israel's air defenses appear to have been relatively effective, and multiple interceptions of Iranian rockets were visible in the skies above Tel Aviv. In any case, the city's inhabitants had already made their way to bomb shelters after earlier receiving warning texts from their government. No Israeli civilians are believed to have been killed, or even injured, in fact. There was, though, some limited damage right in the heart of Israel's capital, with at least one missile breaching Israeli defenses, impacting near to the headquarters of the Mossad intelligence agency. A reporter from PBS gave this report of the aftermath.
This is the impact site for one of those Iranian ballistic missiles. And if you see the size of this crater, that's about 30 feet deep and maybe 50 feet wide. You can see all the debris around here. And to give you a sense of the targets for these strikes, that white building back there, about 1,500 feet behind me, is the headquarters of the spy agency, the Mossad.
Israel has refused to confirm what exact proportion of Iran's rockets were intercepted, saying this could give Iran and Hezbollah information that could help them learn lessons. Israel was less coy after Iran's first attack in April, when they said 99% of Iranian missiles and drones were intercepted. Reuters say that around 100 houses were damaged in Hod HaSharon, that's 20 kilometers northeast of Tel Aviv. 10 houses were also reportedly damaged in the northern Israeli town of Metchala. The IDF has said that all damage to civilian homes and infrastructure is minor and likely caused by shrapnel from intercepted missiles. However, Mohammed Morandi, an academic at the University of Tehran, he's close to the Iranian government. Last night, he tried to talk up the impact of the rocket barrage.
It was a massive blow to the Israeli regime. And the history of this conflict doesn't go back to last year. It is 76 years of ethno-supremacism, ethnic cleansing, and this is a racist regime that you support. What the problem is that you cannot recognize that the difference between you and us is that you support racism and racial hierarchy, and we reject it. And the Israeli regime, if they dare strike back at Iran, we will hit them much harder next time. We will beat them into submission.
Well, they will strike back, won't they? No sovereign country can put up with having 180 ballistic missiles fired at them. So they will hit back, they will hit hard, and they could well hit your nuclear facilities, your oil production installations. They could cause Iran serious damage.
Listen, instead of the rhetoric, be real, because you're misleading your own people. Iran has countless underground missile sites with hundreds of thousands of missiles across the country. They were made after the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan to deal with a potential war with the United States. So this puny regime, it is not a state, it is a colony. It is a racist, ethno-supremacist colony which the people call themselves the chosen people. Unlike you, we do not believe in chosen people. And the Palestinian people on that land who've been displaced and pushed into Gaza and who've been slaughtered regularly over 76 years, we will not stand for that. All people in the whole of Palestine must be equal. The Israeli regime, if they strike Iran, we will hit them much harder next time. And they can pretend that they got away, but we hit them very hard last night. We hit their bases. And unlike the Israeli regime, which constantly carries out slaughter and genocide and was carrying out a Holocaust in Gaza, we struck their military targets because unlike you, we actually care about human rights, not you.
Unsurprisingly, Netanyahu has vowed to retaliate.
Iran made a big mistake tonight, and it will pay for it. The regime in Iran does not understand our determination to defend ourselves and our determination to retaliate against our enemies. We will stand by the rule we established. Whoever attacks us, we will attack them.
Israel has not yet indicated how they intend to respond to yesterday's rocket barrage, and it's been reported they are yet to make any final decision. But Israeli officials have told Axios that the retaliation will be significant and could target oil production facilities and other strategic sites. Targeted assassinations and taking out Iran's air defense system are also being floated as possibilities. Another update from today. Hamas has in the past hour taken responsibility for the Tel Aviv shooting attack yesterday that killed 7 Israelis. In a statement, the group said the coming days will bring death as long as the war against Gaza continues. To discuss the latest developments and what might come next, I'm joined now by Dr. Andreas Krieg, Associate Professor at King's College London and CEO of MENA Analytica. Andreas, thank you so much for joining us. Let's begin with those strikes from Iran. Is it clear now, 24 hours later, is it clear what Iran intended to achieve with that rocket barrage?
Thanks for having me. So Iran has been deemed to be weak. It was deemed to not care about its axis of resistance anymore. It was believed to have withdrawn from that war and being deterred by Israeli action in Lebanon over the last 2 weeks. So Iran wanted to use the occasion now to kind of reset the balance of deterrence, if you will, vis-a-vis Israel, but also kind of save face reputationally, and as the onslaught in Lebanon was ongoing. Wanted to reset the balance, wanted to establish his reputation as being the backer of the axis of resistance, but more importantly, also kind of clearly showing that there are red lines, and if Israel crosses these red lines, Iran will retaliate. And these 3 red lines in particular were, the killing, first of all, the killing of IRGC officers in April, to which Iran responded. Then there was the killing of Haniyeh, the Hamas political leader in Tehran, on Iranian soil, and obviously the killing of Hassan Nasrallah is a key component of this axis of resistance, to which the Iranians also hadn't responded yet. And so that was a clear sort of act of deterrence by punishing Israel for what it has done.
I understand that this was presumably intended, as you say, to sort of restore deterrence. I mean, will it have been effective at that? Because this seems like it was a significant proportion of their ballistic missiles. They've got many more. I think I hear sort of they've got 1,500 perhaps, and they used 200 yesterday. But given it doesn't seem as if these rockets did much damage, no injuries, does it establish deterrence, or does it show that actually Iran don't have many options to sort of bring consequences and costs to Israel?
Well, Iran has been deemed also as a paper tiger when it comes to their rhetoric and their military complex. And that's certainly true. I mean, Iran has for 40 odd years been under sanctions, so their military, in terms of technology, widely stuck in the 1970s. And to make up for this, they have heavily invested into drones and missile technology to kind of balance that equation a little bit. And so they heavily rely on missiles and drones for deep strike capability. And the other component part of their defense, if you will, and offense is that axis of resistance that they're relying upon, this axis of non-state actors across the region. So yes, we don't know how many missiles Iran has. Certainly this yesterday wasn't a very exhaustive strike. I do believe that Iran could do worse and will likely do worse if it's being pushed into a corner. They always make for nice fireworks, but they're still not the sort of ballistic missile technology that we would see other Western countries have, for example. So it's not what it could be. But I would also say what happened yesterday is the worst that we have seen yet. But it is the worst Israel has seen, and I think that's important to note as well. I would say it's probably the most significant deep strike within Israeli territory in its history. Even with all the other wars that we've seen, and have never really been able to penetrate Israel that deeply and with that much impunity, because a lot of the projectiles did, get through. And even though nobody was killed, or I think one person in the occupied territories was killed, but for the most part, no casualties, but still some damage. And it's just the psychological effect of this, and that psychological effect might be enough to make Israel reconsider the consequences of going the next step and potentially having to endure another such attack from Iran, to which it might not have this sort of hermetic, if you will, defense system to intercept these missiles coming in.
And for clarity, I know Israel sort of had advance warning of this. I think a couple of hours or so. I know that was intelligence via the Americans. Would that have been intentional that Iran wanted Israel to know that this was happening because they didn't want to kill lots of people because they thought that would be too escalatory? Was this sort of part of the strategic calculus to fire these rockets but give Israel advance warning, or was that sort of a leak or something that sort of America was able to ascertain via intelligence as opposed to sort of a diplomatic conversation with the Iranians?
No, you're right. It's probably the latter. The Americans are denying that they got a direct or indirect message. It might have been through interlocutors in the Gulf. Still speculative. The Iranians are saying they didn't give any warning. But what can be said is the warning came about 2 hours before the actual strike yesterday afternoon. And that is, in terms of telegraphing in comparison to April, was very much short notice. And it didn't really prepare the Israelis or the Americans well enough to defend as effectively as they could have defended in comparison to how they defended it in April. In April, this was a very long telegraphed sort of attack, and it allowed enough time to make the preparations to make sure the impact was limited. This time around, we've seen the impact was obviously different missiles, mostly different missiles being used this time around, but the impact was significant. The images themselves show how devastating the strikes were, even if no one was killed and even if the damage is fairly limited. It's just the sheer amount of seeing, for Israelis to see something like this happen and seeing these explosions and the sky being lit up. I mean, that has an emotional impact on people.
Let's talk about the international response. This was Joe Biden speaking yesterday.
But based on what we know now, the attack appears to have been defeated and ineffective. And this is testament to Israeli military capability and U.S. military. It's also a testament to intensive planning between the United States and Israel to anticipate and defend against the brazen attack we expected. Make no mistake, the United States is fully supportive of Israel.
That was Joe Biden yesterday. Just before we went live, Joe Biden spoke to reporters. He was asked, would you support Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities? And he said, no. The French and British governments have also said they helped Israel intercept Iranian missiles. Andreas, how significant is international support for Israel here? Could they have intercepted so many rockets were it not for support from the United States? And I mean, I know the UK have said they were involved and France have said they were involved to some degree as well. How much does that support matter to them?
It is significant. It was extremely significant in April this year when more nations were involved and everything was a lot better prepared. This is, as much as possible, Israel requires its allies and partners in the region to do this, especially the United States. Israel on its own would not be able to do as much as they're doing. I mean, they have an excellent missile defense system, but obviously that's, as I said, this is not hermetic. This is not really something that is that can completely seal the country and kind of create a literal dome. That's obviously just a metaphor that the Israelis are using. So some missiles will go through, and every missile you intercept is very significant. And having UK, French, US air power in in areas operating in airspaces that the Israelis might not be able to penetrate that easily, especially over Iraq and potentially over the Gulf. That is very significant, and it will play a very important role in moving forward. And obviously, everyone has an interest to make sure that the fallout of the attack on Israel is as limited as possible, because nobody wants to have this sort of overreaction from either side. But obviously, now we're anticipating some reaction from Israel. Everyone wants to make sure this is bounded and measured to make sure that there is some sort of off ramp, because nobody has an interest in this being an all-out escalation against Iran.
We've got another update. It's a White House statement from just now. Today, we are holding Iran accountable, imposing new sanctions and export controls on Iran. The sanctions target leaders and entities connected to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran's defense ministry, and the Iranian government's missile and drone program that enabled this brazen assault. To be fair, I'm surprised that, given that the US already has quite a lot of sanctions on Iran, I would have thought all of those entities would already be sanctioned. You said a moment ago that you don't think anyone has an interest in escalation here. I mean, lots of people are suggesting that Israel does. Israel is trying to sort of provoke a war with, or sort of entice Iran into a war to then bring the US directly into the conflict and attempt to take out Iran's nuclear program. Does that seem like a sort of plausible analysis of what's going on?
I think we have to be very careful with using the term Israel, in the same meaning. Actually, Netanyahu. I think there's a difference here. Israel doesn't speak with one voice. It's a democratic country. It's a very divided society, very divided civil society as well. It's a divided political landscape. There is a division between different elements of the security sector and the government. Then the government itself is divided between Netanyahu and the far right and more moderate elements in the government. So for Israel to speak with having one coherent strategic vision has been extremely difficult over the last 12 months. While everyone obviously is very much rallying around the flag when it comes to defending Israel against Hamas, defending Israel against Hezbollah, there are certainly differences of opinion of how to deal with these threats. I think the majority of Israelis now want a diplomatic deal in Gaza to get the hostages back, which Netanyahu opposes. And so Netanyahu has crossed red lines time and again, not in the national interest of Israel, but in order to protect himself, basically. I mean, this is all very much driven by political interest rather than national interest. And Israelis have seen that. I mean, for a long time, Israelis have said Netanyahu is responsible for the failure of intelligence on the 7th of October. He's responsible for not dealing with Hamas effectively. He's responsible for not taking opportunities for diplomatic off-ramps time and again. And I think what really turned it around for Netanyahu is the kind of escalation that we've seen in Lebanon. It serves him. He's been able to rally people around the flag. He's been able to reappear as a strongman, as someone who's got Israel's back and is all about Israeli security. And people buy it, even those who don't like him. And so that's an important point in time for Netanyahu, that he's been able to rally Israelis around. I think it definitely plays a role in the provocation or the red lines that say that Netanyahu seems to cross time and again, particularly when it comes to not accepting off-ramps and not accepting off-ramps from Gaza. And we have to understand that what's going on in Lebanon, what's going on in Syria, and also now with Iran, and also in the West Bank, all of this is connected to Gaza. I mean, and obviously Gaza didn't start on the 7th of October. There's a history of this conflict underlying all of this. And Netanyahu has been the principal reason why Israel hasn't made any progress on the two-state solution. He's principally responsible for managing or mismanaging the Gaza relationship, mismanaging the relationship with Hamas, the blockade of Gaza, and so on. So I think he's been using the international community, he's been using the US government to get ahead or to stay in power. And for him, it has been always about political survival. He's not a strategist, he's not a statesman, he's always been a politician.
And finally, I want to talk about what this sort of wider conflagration means for the people of Gaza, because there's one theory that sort of Iran getting involved, Hezbollah being involved, that's acting in solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza because it almost sort of distracts the IDF. They have to fight on multiple fronts. Another theory is that actually sort of while people are distracted by the conflict with Iran, that is an opportunity for Israel to sort of go even harder in Gaza, while I suppose the international community or world opinion is focusing elsewhere. I know Al Jazeera are reporting that Israel has been escalating its attacks since that barrage last night, with 105 people killed in the last 24 hours. What's your sort of view, your analysis of how sort of this conflict expanding would affect the people of Gaza?
Everything about Gaza is terrible. It's the worst man-made human catastrophe in the world right now, and there were opportunities to solve it, and to just continuously blaming Hamas for not making enough effort obviously doesn't solve the issue. The issue here has been Hamas has conceded to quite a lot of points, has been willing to negotiate a way out. Israeli public and Israeli security services pleaded with the government in Israel, with Netanyahu, to take these opportunities for an off-ramp, and he didn't take them. And so I'm extremely pessimistic what this means, because obviously the key issue that we didn't talk about is that the Biden administration is a lame duck. It's just going into elections. It hasn't shown any leadership. It still doesn't show any leadership. It wants the Israelis to take their ceasefire opportunity, and Netanyahu every time rejected it, and there were no consequences to it. And so we're in this position now where in the absence, in the vacuum of US leadership, Netanyahu can do whatever he wants. And it seems like with things really kicking off in Lebanon, and obviously with a strike yesterday from Iran, global media attention is diverted away from Gaza. The killing has been normalized. The dying, the suffering has been normalized. And there are tens of thousands of civilians who've died in Gaza, and that has been normalized. People have accepted it because there's so many other crises happening. And Israel is now dragging the region into some sort of poly-crisis, if you will. And when I say Israel, I mean primarily Bibi Netanyahu. And so Israelis have to ask themselves whether this is in their own national interest. Do they want to fight a multi-front war against the likes of Hezbollah and other non-state actors, but also the likes of Iran, when they are already militarily bogged down on, in terms of capacity? A lot of their bandwidth is consumed around the country, in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Lebanon. That is something that is going to be very difficult to sustain, also emotionally. There is war fatigue in Israel as well. Something's got to give. The great hope is that after the election, once we know who's going to be US president going forward, and that might be in itself a long process considering how very tight margins are. Once we know that, the hope is that there might be a bit of movement to kind of get a deal in Gaza, but I'm still extremely pessimistic. I think the war in Gaza is going to continue long into 2025.
Andreas Krieg, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We really do appreciate it. Keir Starmer remained relatively mute as Israel killed 40,000 Palestinians in Gaza, and he's had little to say about Israel invading its neighbour Lebanon. But when it came to Iran firing rockets towards Israel, rockets that appear to have killed no Israelis, well, he was positively furious.
Good evening. In the last few hours, the Iranian regime has launched over 200 ballistic missiles at civilian targets in Israel. It's too soon to assess the impact fully, but I utterly condemn this attempt by the Iranian regime to harm innocent Israelis, to escalate this incredibly dangerous situation and push the region ever closer to the brink. It cannot be tolerated.
So now Keir Starmer is positively furious. Now, to respond to a couple of things he said there, firstly, there's no evidence there were actually civilian targets. When it comes to Israel, constantly there's these obfuscations. Oh yes, they may have killed thousands of civilians, but they were trying to hit military targets. Now, when it comes to Iran firing rockets into Israel, no civilians are killed. Oh, but we can assume they were hitting civilian targets, even though they went towards Mossad's headquarters and airfields, right? According to Keir Starmer, though, of everything that's happened over the past year, it's this that cannot be tolerated. Gazan hospitals bombed. Meh. Lebanon's capital bombed. Meh. Missiles fired towards Israel. Time to get the Union Jacks out because this is out of order.
We stand with Israel and we recognize her right to self-defense in the face of this aggression. Iran must stop these attacks, together with its proxies like Hezbollah. Iran has menaced the Middle East for far too long, chaos and destruction brought not just to Israel, but to the people they live amongst in Lebanon and beyond. Make no mistake, Britain stands full square against such violence. We support Israel's reasonable demand for the security of its people.
I'm joined now by Eleanor Penny. Eleanor, great to have you on the show. My first question to you, why is Israel, for Keir Starmer, always a lady?
Good question, right? Because Israel has this very fine line to walk in terms of both its ideology and its hasbara, right? The PR that it puts out, framing itself both as this kind of strongman outpost of Western civilization facing us against the barbarians, so-called, that can do the work of keeping the world on the right side of chaos. Is the kind of messaging that we're hearing. And it also needs to be constantly under threat in order to justify the many billions of pounds of handouts that it's getting from the US, from the UK, from other supportive states. And this kind of mirrors what Israel has been saying, look at the onslaught from our enemies, but also don't worry, we have the Iron Dome, we are good to go, right? It has to kind of double talk out both sides of its mouth like that. And this is kind of bound up with the way in which the Israel-Palestine conflict is talked about. In general, it's drawing on this generalized Islamophobic moral panic to paint Palestinians as this sort of bestial, masculine force that threatens this feminized, vulnerable thing that must be protected, and anything is legitimized, anything is valid in a response to that. Now, obviously, this is ludicrous. It's also quite a good way of reframing what are, as we know, and have always been territorial and geostrategic questions of Israeli and US power in the region as a kind of face-off between good and evil, civilization and barbarity. Because if they're political problems, they require political solutions. I don't know, maybe even a ceasefire, heaven forfend, long-lasting peace negotiations. That really isn't concordant with the geostrategic interests of Israel, and certainly not the interests of the Netanyahu administration. So they need to keep this ideological ball in the game. Keir Starmer, I mean, what can you say? Mr. Human Rights Lawyer. He has... Let's look at the language that he used. He said he utterly condemns it, right? Let's cycle back to in October of last year and think about the language that he was using to talk about the Israeli incursion into Gaza when it first started, saying that they have every right to cut off water, to cut off vital supplies, that the so-called international rules-based order could just be ripped up and thrown away. Now, it's back and it's alive and it's kicking, but only when it comes to the defense of Israel. What can you say, really, other than this is a continued disgrace from a government that continues to, despite its mealy-mouthed talk about a ceasefire, arm Israel to the teeth? And when we are thinking about a region that is already teetering on the precipice of out-and-out conflict, which ordinary people will suffer the most cost, that are already suffering the most cost, it's doing nothing.
I mean, I've seen people sort of respond to people discussing this on Twitter saying, it is the convention that, if you call a ship her, I think you can call a nation her. But as far as I understand it, Keir Starmer doesn't call any other country her, right? There is no other country that sort of has this strange gender. He's never said Lebanon has a right to defend herself, right? Or Palestine, she has a right to a state. I don't know what you'd do if you're sort of giving that gendered language. But when it's just, he talks about Israel so differently to how he talks about any other country. And it is really, really strange. And the fact that sort of, of course, as you say, Eleanor, sort of in October last year, he was so slow to even sort of remotely condemn something. He was just like, they can cut off the water if they want. But now they have moved to this sort of, we want a ceasefire, too many innocent civilians are being killed. But he's never got out and stood in front of two Union Jacks for it, right? But the moment that some missiles are fired at Israel, even though they haven't killed any Israelis, this is where he draws the line. This is where we've got to put a stop to it. This is outrageous, because what we cannot tolerate is any country or government taking action that could possibly widen the conflict in the Middle East, right? all while we're still sending arms to Israel, right? The country that has basically caused all of this. I mean, it has, right? It has. The reason that there isn't peace in that particular region is because Israel has refused to come to any kind of peace agreement with its neighbors because it wants a bigger country than it currently has. That hasn't always been the case. Whatever your opinion on Zionism, it was the case that the Arab states surrounding Israel didn't want any Israel to exist, right? Disagree with that or agree with it. But for a very long time, we showed this on Monday's show, the Arab states have all been saying, look, if you just go back to your 1967 borders, we can have peace. But Israel doesn't want to do that, which means that there is constant war. Of course, Iran, not an Arab state, but the reason they are able to have these proxies in places such as Lebanon is because Lebanon is a very weak state, partly because Israel keeps intervening. The Conservative Party conference continues to throw up some bizarre and faintly surreal sound bites. Yesterday, leadership contender Kemi Badenoch made this striking claim.
It is not all civil servants. I don't want people to get me wrong. I think that civil servants are like everybody else. They come in to do a job, and I would say about 10% of them are absolutely magnificent. And the trick to being a good minister is to find the good ones quickly, bring them close, and try and get the bad ones out of your department as quickly as possible. There's about 5 to 10% of them who are very, very bad, should be in prison bad. Leaking official secrets, undermining their ministers, telling, agitating. I had some of it in my department, usually union-led. But most of them actually want to do a good job. And the good ones are very frustrated by the bad ones.
Now, obviously, that was a joke. I don't think Kemi Badenoch is genuinely saying that if she were to be elected Tory leader and then the Tories were to win a general election, she would put 5 to 10% of civil servants in prison. But, if you want to be a statesperson, you probably shouldn't even joke about that, right? It was already the case that civil servants were, getting really goddamn annoyed at many Tory government ministers. You remember sort of Jacob Rees-Mogg putting sheets on their paper, on their table saying, stop working from home, sort of constantly bashing them in public. To suggest that you're going to send them to prison in the middle of a leadership election, I'm not sure if that's so wise. Today, all 4 leadership candidates were given the opportunity to make their case to members. Robert Jenrick decided to practice his stand-up routine.
What about our new cabinet? Well, Rachel Reeves, as wooden as Pinocchio, and only barely more honest. And then we've got Ed Miliband. Whoever tells you the grown-ups are back in charge, look at Ed Miliband. A Wallace missing his grommet. And then, there's David Lammy, our Foreign Secretary. Living proof that there is a more annoying LBC presenter than James O'Brien.
I don't know who writes his speeches, but I didn't think that was that bad. It seems to have gone down quite well in the conference hall. And it definitely compared positively or favourably with Jacob Rees-Mogg's attempt a day earlier.
We've bought in to the language of equality. Now, I hope our distinguished chairman is a chairman, not a chair. The chair was what I was sitting on. Do you want my very brief lecture? My very brief lecture on the word man. If you go back to the Anglo-Saxon, there were were-men and woe-men. The man bit means people. And where is the last remaining vestige of the word were? Werewolf. They're always male, I'm sorry to tell the gentlemen in this audience. If there were woe-wolves, they would be female, but they never seem to come into fashion. Man is the people bit of it, were and woe. So if you want to be politically correct, bring back the were bit and call us were-men. Were chairman? Anyway, it'll get very confusing. But don't give in to the lefty use of language. It is absolutely fundamental.
I think he writes his own speeches. That was very, very tortured. Robert Jenrick's jokes were slightly better, and it hasn't done him any harm. So he is now very much the favourite to be the next Tory leader. So this is the latest odds. It was Kemi Badenoch, by the way, who was the favourite. She's now in third. Robert Jenrick on 10 to 11. I always get confused when they're so close, the numbers. James Cleverly, 7 to 4. Kemi Badenoch, 4 to 1. And Tom Tugendhat, 20 to 1. Eleanor, were you tickled by Conservative Party conference today?
Say what you like about James O'Brien. He's not actively arming Israel. So, probably David Lammy is like inching ahead on the objectionable presenter fronts there. But I do think it's funny watching this play out because, of course, the Tory party was already floundering before it went into the last general election. And now it doesn't have the daily business of running the state to kind of distract itself. So all of these sort of strange, swivel-eyed, paranoid tendencies are really getting their time in the sun. And because these are so violently, rampantly, unendingly bloody weird, it's easy to kind of sidestep how concerning some of these things are. Because obviously, as you say, Kemi Badenoch is almost certainly joking, right? It's a joke. It's a fun joke that we can all enjoy. But of course, as with all of these jokes, it's also a way of signaling her true intentions, of signaling her loyalties there. And as we've known for years, Tory party has no new ideas economically, and they've got no sort of Thatcherite program of renewal that they can pull on. So they're rummaging around in the back of the cupboard of this sort of broad church of right-wing ideas for something to cling to, and they found stuff that is honestly deeply fascistic, right? The courts, the laws, civil procedure is framed as the enemy. The mechanisms of the state are infested with these saboteurs that need to be driven out with sticks. This is the kind of language that she's using. And these are the kinds of things that she's using to try and win the vote for the Tory party. So that doesn't just speak to what Badenoch is trying to push as her agenda, but what she thinks will fly with the party in general. I think this is the kind of thing that we should really be paying attention to, not just when it comes to the Tory party, but also when it comes to the ruling party, when it comes to Labour, who have one ear to the wall of Tory party conference, thinking about what ideas that they can borrow. We've seen this for the past, probably 4 years of the Keir Starmer's leadership, I should say.
Do you think Labour are quasi-fascistic?
I don't think I would go so far as to call Labour quasi-fascistic, but what I would certainly say is that they are very reliably sympathetic to the idea that the true demos, the true spirit of the British people that needs to be represented under any circumstances at any cost is the kind of voting public that only want to be more mean to migrants and maybe make sure that their wheelie bins are picked up on time, right? And Keir Starmer, not just Keir Starmer, Yvette Cooper, a lot of other people in Labour Party's administration are signalling their loyalty to that kind of politics repeatedly by recycling very, very right-wing and very violent talking points with real consequences for people's lives. Stuff like, we need to stop small boats. We need to strengthen the borders. Immigration is too high. For them, they think of it as a vote winner, but actually on the ground, this has a real human cost.
The US line on Israel has always been inconsistent. On the one hand, they say they want a diplomatic solution between Israel and its rivals. On the other, they arm Israel to the teeth and give it unconditional diplomatic backing, which means Israel has no interest in any peace deal. But the fact that Washington's stories don't add up has rarely been made as clear as in these answers by State Department spokesperson Matt Miller responding to Zateo's Prem Fakir.
Prem, go ahead.
Thank you, Matt. What we're seeing in Lebanon, we saw a similar pattern with regards to Rafah. First, the U.S. saying that they wouldn't want to see Israel conducting major operations. Then Israel going ahead with what they called limited operations, and then this continued tolerance of sort of day-to-day attacks. That has led to over 44% of all buildings in Rafah being either destroyed or damaged, according to satellite photos. Which is to say that there might not have been a major operation in Rafah, but there was cumulative attacks that led to a good deal of destruction. So how does this precedent of Rafah portend for Lebanon?
So every conflict is different, but if you look at what we continue to engage with Israel about when it comes to Lebanon, is ensuring that they have the ability to attack terrorist targets, terrorist infrastructure, a terrorist organization, but ultimately we want to see a diplomatic resolution.
But was that the case with Rafah, for instance, not just in Rafah, but
we've never wanted to see a diplomatic resolution with Hamas.
Well, Okay. Well, what about the ceasefire?
We wanted to see a ceasefire, but we have always been committed. We have always been committed to the destruction of Hamas. We did want to see a ceasefire, but we have always made clear that we wanted to see a different authority moving forward in governance of Gaza.
That is so stupid. Like, that doesn't make any. They want a ceasefire. They want a diplomatic resolution, but they don't want a diplomatic resolution with one of the sides who are fighting. You can't make a ceasefire if you have a diplomatic resolution with someone else, right? You can't say, "Oh, we'll negotiate a ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian Authority." What good's that going to do? It's not the Israel and the Palestinian Authority that are fighting. The idea that you're calling for a ceasefire in the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Now, obviously, Israel's war is affecting many more people than Hamas, right? It is a war against the Palestinian people. But when you're talking about a ceasefire, you're talking about the two sides who are fighting. The two sides who are fighting is Hamas and the IDF, the Israeli military. And he's saying, we want a ceasefire, but we won't negotiate with Hamas. We just want to destroy Hamas. Well, then, buddy, you don't want a ceasefire, right? That's completely inconsistent. And it gets worse. Let's look at some more of that exchange.
Okay, but so for instance, other UN satellite image shows that 66% of Gaza structures have been damaged. And you earlier today said that the U.S. supports the targeting of terrorist infrastructure, not civilian infrastructure. Does the U.S. believe 66% of Gaza's buildings are terrorist infrastructure?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Which is why we have been engaged to try to reach a ceasefire to end that conflict, which is why we have been pushing for a ceasefire to months. And I wish that Hamas would come to the table and work with us on a ceasefire. As you heard me saying earlier, Hamas has been absent for weeks, won't even respond to the mediators putting forward ideas asking whether they would agree to a ceasefire or not. Look, you can talk about Israel and the culpability that Israel has and the tough decisions that Israel needs to make. And it's absolutely true that Israel needs to make tough decisions to get to a ceasefire. But the way out of this conflict is a ceasefire. And it is Hamas that is missing in action right now that won't come to the table to talk about one.
We don't want a diplomatic resolution with Hamas. We want to destroy Hamas. That's what he said in the first part of that clip we showed you. In the second part of the clip, and they were contiguous. They were within the same 2 minutes. He says, Hamas are outrageous. Hamas are not letting us come to a diplomatic resolution because they won't come to the table. Well, maybe that's because 30 seconds ago, you said you don't want a diplomatic resolution with Hamas. You just want to destroy Hamas. So how dare you not turn up to the negotiations? Oh, we didn't want to negotiate with them. We just wanted to destroy them. It's completely nonsensical. And right, we've talked over and over and over again on this show about how the United States policy doesn't make sense. It's duplicitous. I mean, it makes sense from if you want a greater Israel, for example, or if you're trying to appease an Israel lobby, but it doesn't make sense sort of. It's not coherent, let's say, because America say we want peace, we don't want escalation, but they continue to sort of arm Israel to the teeth and give it absolute diplomatic cover. So they say, oh, we're asking him nicely to stop killing so many civilians. We're asking him nicely not to start a broader war with Lebanon, but at the same time, we'll veto any resolution at the UN Security Council, which might apply some real pressure to Israel. So it was always completely inconsistent. But I have never heard it being articulated in such a way where within 2 minutes, it's actually complete nonsense, right? You could know nothing about the war and hear those 2 minutes and think, this guy is not making any sense whatsoever. Eleanor, I mean, people talk about Joe Biden's cognitive decline. Matt Miller seems, he's young and sprightly, but is there a sense in which the whole administration is just incapable of making sense anymore?
Right. Maybe we should be talking about cognitive dissonance rather than cognitive decline, because, of course, Israel has this year assassinated one of the chief peace negotiators, right? Ismail Haniyeh, a few months ago, was taken out by Mossad, which was supposed to be one of the chief organizations over the other side of the peace negotiating table. Like, it's fundamentally ludicrous. And as you were saying I don't want a ceasefire with Hamas involved, it's just another way of saying, I don't want a ceasefire, right? It's a way of justifying delays and detours and pretending it's a principled stance because, despite whatever criticisms you may rightly have about Hamas as an organization, Hamas is who you have to negotiate with, right? If the UK was under siege by France, for instance, and Macron was saying, of course I want a peace, of course I want a ceasefire deal, negotiating with Labour. Okay, who do you want to negotiate with then? These aren't serious propositions, they aren't serious people, and it's really sickening how fundamentally unserious these approaches are, given that Gaza is running out of soil to bury its dead, right? That's the situation. So when Matt Miller is doing this sort of strange double talk, he's sort of doing like PR cartwheels to try and squeeze all of these necessarily contradictory messages into one nice, neat soundbite. This is the situation it's actually allowing, right? This is a way in which the US continues to soft pedal its own complicity, right? This very much reminds me of the Israeli historian Ilan Pappé's approach to the two solution, right? Or rather the approach to how the two-state solution is talked about, right? It's just something that now politicians are allowed to trot out and say, despite the fact that they may be doing absolutely nothing to push it forward and absolutely everything to stymie it wherever it might have the possibility of actually coming into existence, right? It's just this sort of corpse that gets dressed up and paraded out, and then once it's served its function, it gets sort of, neatly shoved away again, right? Ceasefire talk from an administration that has been Israel's not only biggest supporter, but treating Israel as essentially its own kind of military base, its own military flank for its own geostrategic interests in the region. Why should we believe anything that this administration has to say? And I think people are very rightly thinking about that when they're turning to the polls in November, right? Many people across the US are looking at the offerings given from Matt Miller and saying, is this it? Is this the kind of liberal alternative to a Trumpian dystopia, yet more funding of the same kind of genocidal policies? Like, is there not an alternative? And so Matt Miller has an unenviable job, right? Which is to sell to the general public Israel's complicity, US complicity in Israel's genocide, right? Pretty hard to do, thankfully, very hard to do. But it's just so representative of the kind of pressure that the Biden administration is under, because in order to pull off an election victory, it's going to have something serious to say to the many millions of Americans who are looking at what their government is doing, who are looking at where their tax dollars are going and thinking, not in my name.
You could kind of see, because obviously Matt Miller is going to be an intelligent guy, right? You don't get that job if you're like stupid. So you could kind of see the cogs turning in his head where he's realizing, shit, what I just said is not consistent at all with what I'm saying now. I hope no one notices. You're also in a room with quite a lot of intelligent journalists. It's sort of like, hopefully we're going to move on to a different questioner in a moment, because I know what I'm saying doesn't make any sense whatsoever. We got some footage to show. This is video verified by Evan Hill of The Washington Post, a very good follow actually on Twitter. It's showing Israeli forces evacuating casualties by helicopter across the border from the Lebanese village of Adassa, where Hezbollah claims to have staged an ambush today. This will be really, really interesting sort of as a running story when Israel have gone into Lebanon previously. It hasn't tended to have gone particularly well. So in 1982, in 2006, both times Hezbollah sort of mounted a fairly effective resistance. Israel suffered many casualties and didn't achieve very much. There have been hopes in Israel that they have severely deteriorated the capacity of Hezbollah by taking out its leader and a bunch of other senior commanders over the past couple of weeks. Of course, also that pager attack would have taken out, would have injured, presumably that's a lot of people out of action. Thousands of, I think it was 1,500, 3,000, I can't remember the exact number, but many, many people injured by those pages, potentially somewhat senior. So there had been a bit of speculation that maybe Hezbollah were so weakened at this point in time that Israel would be able to, fight a much more effective war in Lebanon than they had done previously. So this is something we, I suppose, are about to discover. Obviously, there's not much we can sort of really interpret from that footage there, or the fact that 8 Israeli soldiers have been killed. By now, that doesn't really tell us much about Hezbollah's fighting force, but I think that will be a big story over the next few days, weeks, potentially even months. You've been watching Novara Media. Good night.